My name is Christy Spire and I'm the Adaptive Communities Coordinator here with Green Adelaide, and we're very proud and excited to invite you to this first instalment of our seminar series, bit of an experiment, so we'd love your feedback as we go along. And firstly, I would like to acknowledge the land that I'm coming to you from. I'm assuming most of you are from around Green Adelaide, but many of you might watch this later. And I hope that you can acknowledge the land that you're meeting on. So I'd like to do it in Ghana, Mani Ngadlu, Tapanti Ngadlu Ghana, Yatanga Imparente, which translates to we acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Ghana people. And as this slide says as well, that we hold their lands and waters and community with great respect, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And it's such a privilege to be able to work with the Ghana people that we are, that we do within Green Adelaide. And I know that many of you have the privilege of knowing these elders past, present and emerging. So welcome again, and this seminar series we're running to help share the work of Green Adelaide and inspire you all in the work that you're doing to help Adelaide become cooler, greener, wilder and more climate resilient. And as we all know, we all work together in this. Not one of us can do it alone. So just a reminder that the session is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. We'll be sure to send you the links afterwards. And also you are invited throughout this session to ask questions at any time and pop them in the chat. I know that's hard to access the chat if you're not on a desktop, but even if you're on your phone, you might be able to work it out. And we will endeavour to answer as many of these as we can at the end of the session. We've only got 15 minutes at the end, but if we don't get to them, we'll also try and answer them through a follow-up email as well. So please do put any question in there. No question is too dumb or silly or small. We really want these sessions to be helping you in your understandings. So just a brief intro from me to the session. Cities are really increasingly becoming recognised for their importance to urban biodiversity, and especially Adelaide. Adelaide is within a biodiversity hotspot, and so we are a really uniquely placed city to do this type of work. And we have such a strong history of working in urban ecology, and that's really why biodiversity sensitive urban design was chosen as one of Green Adelaide's 7 legislative priorities. And Sarah and Georgia are going to do a great presentation for you all today, but just simply BSUD, as it is, the acronym is shortened to, aims to create urban areas which make a positive on-site contribution to biodiversity through the provision of essential habitat and food resources for native animals. And as this slide showcases, BSUD can be applied across multiple scales and contexts, such as your own backyard, streetscapes, schools, or large-scale infrastructure projects. And we're going to hear a few examples of those types of projects today. So we're really pleased to again have Professor Sarah Bekessy from RMIT and Dr. Georgia Garrard from Melbourne University here with us today, who first coined this BSUD concept and who are the leading experts in this field. This talk is part of a body of work that Georgia and Sarah are undertaking for Green Adelaide that involves the development of an evidence base and a series of case studies for BSUD in Adelaide. A little bit about them both. Sarah's been teaching in sustainability and urban planning at RMIT since 2004. And she's interested into the intersection between science and policy in environmental management. And she leads the interdisciplinary conservation science research group. So you can go and check them out and see what other research they're doing. Georgia is a senior lecturer in sustainability in the Office for the Environmental Program and School of Ecosystems and Forest Sciences at the Uni of Melbourne. And her research addresses the critical challenges of conserving biodiversity in human-dominated landscapes, which I'm sure you can all agree is the challenge that a lot of us are facing. So the format of today's session is we've got presentation by Sarah and Georgia of 40 minutes, and then we're going to have 15 minutes at the end for questions and a little snapshot of what Green Adelaide is doing to enable BSUD across Adelaide. So nice, short, sharp and shiny, and we'll have you out of your seats and into your nature in your backyard and in your city by 5 o'clock. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand over to Sarah and Georgia now. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Christy, and thanks to Nat also for organising. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the fantastic people we've been working with in Green Adelaide. I don't know if you guys out there realised how awesome Green Adelaide and the group and the people in Green Adelaide are, but it's we've been extremely impressed. So thanks, Ali, Jason and Alyssa especially, but everyone we've kind of met with and engaged with throughout this last year. Yeah, I'd like to start by acknowledging that, we're definitely on different sort of country than probably most of you. I'm phoning in here from Melbourne, so I'm on Wurundjeri land, and Georgia's in Castlemaine in central Victoria, and she's in Djadja country. But we also pay our deepest respects to ancestors and elders past and present of the unceded lands in Victoria of which we meet. And I think it's really important to reflect a bit on why it's particularly relevant to pay that respect, and that is, in essence, that cities are equally Aboriginal places. In fact, more First Peoples live in cities than they do in rural areas. We have just so much to learn from and implement from the thousands of years of caring for country that have happened in cities, and we can certainly all benefit immensely from taking that approach. So today we're going to be talking about why BSUD. We've all been sold on greening, but why would we take it that extra step and think about biodiversity in cities? We're going to talk about what BSUD is. Georgia's going to take you through what the process is and how we sort of implement it in really quite different sort of situations. Then we're going to take you through a set of case studies, both real and things that are actually currently being constructed and built. And then we'll finish up by talking about some of the next steps that we're hoping will be taken. So whenever you're ready, Georgia, we might share the slides. I'm really just going to start by sort of reflecting on the fact that cities have been places that naturally, well, we've kind of tried to keep, if you want to put it in one way, we've worked very hard to try and keep nature out for many, many years. In fact, the whole idea of a city was a safe place from nature in some respects. And so, it's only been recent sort of decades we've really largely started to appreciate that, inviting nature back in is going to be absolutely critical to the livability and probably the habitability of cities going into the future. And so we now know that, going to the next slide, that greening is something that we should all embrace. And I'd say quite wholeheartedly that it has been embraced. Urban forest strategies and urban greening strategies are really pretty mainstream around the world, and certainly in Australia. But I think going to that next step of why would we actually consider biodiversity greening and not just kind of a plane tree? I mean, the thing is, you can fill a city with trees and have very little benefit for biodiversity. So why would we bother going that extra step of really thinking about having biodiverse greening? And the first reason is that, cities are actually biodiversity hotspots. This is a largely unappreciated concept, I think, out there in the general public, but cities harbour some of our most critically endangered species and ecosystems. Some species just traverse through cities, or sometimes rely on their habitat at certain times or resources at certain times of the year. But other species, 39 of them in fact, are utterly dependent on cities, and these are threatened species, utterly dependent on cities for their habitat. So if we don't think about biodiversity in cities, it's a hugely wasted opportunity in terms of biodiversity conservation. The next reason, I suppose, is that biodiverse greening is like turbo boosted urban greening. It's all the benefits that you know are related to greening are basically maximised when you put biodiversity in the mix. And the one that I suppose is the most compelling perhaps is the health and wellbeing benefits. For some reason, biodiversity just makes us physically and mentally more healthy. And whether it be the cognitive functioning of our children or our own ability to be resilient to, diseases, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, whether it's linked to our mental well-being, our sense of place, our identity, our ability to concentrate and reflect, and our mental well-being, our level of socialisation, our lack of loneliness. These are sort of things that have all been linked explicitly to biodiverse greening, not just greening necessarily. If we go to the next slide, the other benefits have also been well documented. Oh, actually, this is just following on from those health benefits that I just highlighted. There's some really interesting work coming out of Adelaide that I think might be the subject of your next seminar. Is that correct, Christy? Which is linking native vegetation in parklands to our immune health, which I think is a highly intriguing topic, certainly worthy of its own seminar, and hopefully you'll learn more about that in the next seminar. The next slide would probably highlight the fact. Now, maybe some of you know where this is. This is Windsor Street in Unley, and I think the fact is it's not Berlin, it's not London, it's not New York, and we know that because of the vegetation. And if you were there, you'd be able to smell that vegetation, and you'd hear the vegetation, hear the shimmering of that beautiful she oak, and you hear the birds, and you could look at it and say this could be nowhere else. And that is a very underappreciated aspect of biodiverse urban greening that I think we all need to embrace, that idea that we can generate a sense of place in cities that is utterly unique and Australian through the way that we kind of green our streetscapes. And moving on to the next slide. We can even sort of work a little bit harder that sense of place by embracing and concentrating on species that have cultural significance as well. And this is certainly something that we're doing in Melbourne. I know it's something you're pursuing in Adelaide as well. But the idea that we can bring back species that have particular cultural significance to First Peoples of these places. This is an example of a butterfly that once used to emerge at the start of one of the 7 Wurundjeri seasons, and the City of Melbourne are really keen to, recreate that event as a way of connecting people with the idea that there are 7 seasons, that the Wurundjeri placed real significance around the emergence of this butterfly, and we can all be part of that sort of like beautiful story. The other kind of final reason, a little bit more boring but certainly compelling, is that we're committed to do it. And certainly in Adelaide, you've got some really strong and wonderful commitments to try and bring biodiversity and enhance biodiversity in cities. And the fact that BSUD is now a legislative priority is a fantastic development in Adelaide, but certainly all levels of government have rightly kind of committed to trying to do this. I'm now going to hand over to Georgia, who's going to take you through the basic ideas of BSUD and the principles and how to implement them.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think Christy's done a really nice job actually of summarising what biodiversity sensitive urban design is in her introduction. But essentially, we designed biodiversity sensitive urban design as a process for incorporating nature into our cities, but not just into the parks of our cities, but to try and weave it through the built environment of our cities. And I guess now the language is kind of shifting, but I think we could say it's a process for building nature positive cities. And we designed it as a process that would be able to take ecological knowledge and format it and provide it in a way that planners and developers hopefully can use to really embed biodiversity into the plan and design of cities. And so in order to do this, it steps people through, a relatively basic, I guess, process, but I guess the devil's in the detail when you start trying to do it. The first thing that we ask people to do is just to understand what biodiversity they already have. And when I'm talking about people, I'm talking about people who might be thinking about redesigning their garden, people who might be thinking about, you know, the construction of a new apartment block, all the way through to planners and developers who are thinking about how do I plan this new precinct or this new suburb on the outskirts of cities. So the first step is to understand what you have, and the next step is to identify what your biodiversity objectives are for this site. And we'll go through those in a minute, but essentially the process asks people to do this at the same time as they're identifying their development objectives. And this is because when you get to the next step, which is to identify your biodiversity sensitive urban design actions, what you want to do is identify things that are going to help you achieve your biodiversity objectives, but at the same time as you're working on achieving your development objectives. And we're trying to remove biodiversity as being at odds and in conflict with other development objectives. The process then asks people to assess the designs for their potential to deliver biodiversity outcomes, and then either decide and go ahead and do it, or if you don't think you're meeting some of your objectives, to go back either to those objectives or to the next step and think about whether there are other things you can do that would help you achieve those same outcomes. So I'm going to briefly step through some of these. So first of all, thinking about your objectives, this is really just asking you, what would you like to achieve? And for biodiversity, this could include things like improving the persistence of threatened species or ecosystems that exist there. It might include bringing back species that used to exist in an area but have gone locally extinct. Or it might include, for example, creating conditions for culturally or ecologically important species. And these sometimes might be species that were not there in the first place. So thinking about kind of novel, in the context of novel environments. These are just some of the things that you might want to choose. We often talk about objectives as being target species. And I just wanted to note that we do this for a reason. It's not because we think species are the only bit of biodiversity that are important. It's because they provide a really tangible hook that people in the community can hold on to, that stakeholders can hold on to, and that you can use to help identify and design your environments in ways that's going to satisfy that species. So you might want to think about whether or not it's ecologically feasible to have that species at a site. You might be thinking about whether the species has any economic, conservation or cultural value. And probably you're going to be thinking about the social acceptability of that species. So the classic example is people don't want snakes in cities. And I think we would probably, unless under very special circumstances, not really advise that people design to enhance snake habitat deliberately in their cities. But you might also want to be thinking about whether or not this species acts as a bit of an umbrella for other species as well. So if you design for that species, are you going to get a whole lot of other species as well? So when designing, when using BSUD, what we suggest is that people think about 3 or 4 things, and these are resources. So what does the species need to survive? The threats that might persist in the environment and how you can avoid them, and then thinking about key barriers to movement and how you can overcome them. So for resources, we know that having structurally and species diverse native vegetation is critical. Many of the bird species that we want to see in our cities will only be there if we provide this kind of structurally diverse vegetation with a mid-story. This photo also has a whole lot of ground dwelling habitat as well, so things like rocks and fallen logs. But also think about not just naturalistic kind of habitat, but how you can incorporate novel habitat into the built form. So here we have the Jerusalem Bird Observatory. It has a green roof, as you can see, but it also has these specifically designed nesting boxes, which are incorporated into the outer walls of the building, right in the middle of a big city. And then think about providing resources in street trees, which are generally thought about as a kind of greening for cooling kind of nature-based solution, but they're also one of the key floral resources for many birds and insects in our city. So think about not only providing some floral resources, but think about, when do those trees flower? Can you provide a range of species that are going to be flowering at different times of year to provide resources all year round? I've listed a couple of threats here. I've just shown photos of a couple of threats to biodiversity that exist in urban environments. These are human environments. We can't avoid all threats, but we certainly can minimise some of them. So cat containment policies are enacted by many councils now around Victoria, the ACT and other states. And the bottom right just shows an example of a building that has it's using a nifty way to stop birds striking their windows, and that's just by angling them down towards the ground. So the birds don't think they're a nice little gap in the vegetation. And then there's just a wealth of information out there about addressing things like light pollution in cities, and also considering things like noise pollution as well. Connectivity is probably one of the things that people can relate to most easily. So enhancing the movement of species that aren't people through the landscape through things like wildlife bridges and road underpasses that are specifically designed for different species. We've got the koala here, and the grate on the mid-right is for a frog, growling grass frog, but also thinking about how you can turn human connectivity corridors into biodiversity connectivity corridors as well. And so these types of linear pathways through the urban environment, such as the High Line and this stream that we've daylighted in Seoul, really can provide an opportunity for biodiversity. And then the last thing is to just think about design that facilitates positive human-nature interactions, because the last thing we want is to bring biodiversity into an urban environment in a way that's going to challenge people in ways that you don't want to challenge people. And here are just a few ways that people are doing this. So providing cues to care through signage sends a message to people that even though they might not think that grassland is worth anything, there are people who are in charge who think it is. And so you're sending a message to them that this is important. You can design your infrastructure such that you engage people with the system without having them trample it and destroy it, and just engaging the community through things like schools, community groups, community gardening is a great way to facilitate these positive interactions. And then finally, thinking about how the built form itself facilitates people's interaction with nature. See, Sarah's popping up there to give me a little hurry on. And this is just really thinking about low-rise apartment living as a way to connect people with the native vegetation on the street level, but also creating a sense of stewardship through semi-private courtyards can be a way to help facilitate those positive nature interactions. So what we're going to do in this next bit is just go through we've got 4 case studies, and they kind of target different types of urban environments. So the first one I'm going to talk about is an urban renewal site. We'll also talk about BSUD in an urban greenfield, and then think about how you might retrofit existing suburbs and small spaces for biodiversity sensitive urban design. So the first site is Fisherman's Bend. So this is a site in Melbourne. It is, I think, still Australia's largest urban renewal site, and I've just highlighted this area of Fisherman's Bend down here. You can see that it is approximately the same size or larger than the Melbourne CBD. And so it's a huge new urban renewal development. So we were contracted by the state government to provide BSUD advice for this development. And most of the work I'm going to talk about was done by Dr. Holly Kirk at Icon Science in RMIT. So the first thing that we did was to try and set biodiversity objectives for the site through stakeholder workshops. And so these were a really great way to get buy-in from stakeholders, which meant that they were kind of engaged in the process all the way through. So we came up with these 6 or 7 kind of really broad themes. These are the types of things that people thought about when they thought about what they wanted Fisherman's Bend to be like. And then we used those themes to identify target species. And these target species were species that we knew if we provided the resources and the habitat that these species needed to survive in this environment, we would be delivering on these broad themes around a place of shifting waters and bringing the senses together and really recognising the 7 seasons. So we chose these 7 target species. I'm going to focus on BSUD for just one of them now, which is the superb fairy wren, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The first step was to identify where is the existing habitat for this species already at Fisherman's Bend, and you can see that here in the green. So really it's centred around one very big restored green space, the Westgate Park. And so the next thing we did was start to introduce different habitat interventions and different resource interventions that we knew would help this species move about the site. And we chose the connectivity of the site, so the ability of the species to move through the site, as our way of evaluating different scenarios. And you can see this represented here. So essentially this connectivity does like a kind of electrical current modelling, and it says how easy is it, how much resistance is there in the landscape to this species moving across. And so you can see in the top left, we have the existing environment where there are these 2 white patches, which are the existing habitat for the species. And what you can see is that south of the freeway, there's a lot of movement. So the species is able to use street trees and other vegetation in the landscape to move through the landscape. But north of the Westgate Bridge, there's no connectivity for this species. And so what Holly did was model the introduction of things like green bridges across the freeway and new habitat additions through the northern part of the site, including a green link which moved all the way through the site from the Westgate Park in the southwest through to the top of the green bridges. And then she modelled the connectivity, which is essentially the current here. And so what she's able to show is that, you know, the current connectivity at the site is very low, and that by introducing these features, we can increase the connectivity of the site dramatically. And so we use these to make a number of recommendations in the public realm, including things like having diverse native understory vegetation and using these green bridges, but also in the private realm, so the types of novel habitats that could be provided to link the public and private realm, including this green link through the employment precinct. And we spent quite a lot of time working with designers to come up with a green link that would facilitate the movement of people and the ferry ran through the habitat, and then also made some recommendations about threat mitigation. So that's just one example of a case study that we've used. I had to race through it, but we're always happy to answer any questions if you have any. So I'll hand over to Sarah to talk about BSUD and greenfield development.
Thanks, Georgia. So, you know, we have actually really undertaken BSUD plans for really quite diverse sites, and this one in particular is a really interesting one. It's a greenfield development being undertaken by quite a mainstream developer, but they were keen to look at how they could incorporate biodiversity in novel ways into this landscape. So if you go to the next slide, one of the key ways that they were thinking they could do this is by, rather than doing the whole site, which was thought to be, you know, perhaps a little bit risky, start with some biodiverse streets where we could really test these ideas and we could implement them and then potentially test them, because we'll have lots of other streets in the development that don't have the same treatment. So if you go to the next slide, we developed up some concepts that were to do with delivering habitat, again for a range of focal species. So, you know, brought together traditional owners, nursery owners, plant nursery owners, friends of groups, people who live in the area, all the local councils, obviously, the water and infrastructure providers, and all sorts of other government kind of agencies, NGOs. It's a big kind of event, this stakeholder workshop, and elicited these kind of objectives and this a set of focal species. So just remembering that plants are also biodiversity, and BSUD is not just about animals. And so actually a big focus of the biodiverse streets is actually providing, habitat and by planting plant species that are actually, culturally significant. And that was a key request actually of the traditional owners of this area, is to really focus on plants as well. So moving on, the idea was to try and sort of have a pretty kind of normal, not too challenging concept of a sort of a greenfield street, but then actually build in some really key BSUD design features. So I'm going to take you through them briefly. The first one go to the next slide, is native ground covers. So this is the idea that even when you have, line of sight issues, for example, with driveways and the like, you can still have diversity of structure in terms of a canopy and an understory. And here we have low maintenance, no mow or kind of mowable ground cover that can, reduce urban heat. It can retain soil moisture, but it can also provides diverse resources for species. The next design feature is, this is a kind of controversial one actually, but we really felt that having a footpath or just on one side of the street would actually provide a capacity in the streetscape to provide much more substantial areas for biodiversity. It also has the benefits of lowering maintenance costs and, reducing urban heat and the like. The next one is having mid-story verge vegetation. So this is where we have, a mid-story, which isn't it? It's a strangely kind of missing element of many of our streetscapes in cities, and yet it's so critical for many of the species that we care about. We can reduce maintenance costs, reduce irrigation, urban heat. And it's really, I think it's partly key to this kind of concept of delivering sense of place. And it also, delivers a lot of resources for species. The next one is passive irrigation beds. So this is the idea that we can have pollution runoff and stormwater control in these irrigation beds. It's sort of like a WSUD meets BSUD concept that was actually quite appealing to the council. Moving on, the fifth one is to do with, actually this is an interesting idea of just seeing even the concept of a retaining wall. Why not have novel habitats within your retaining walls, having increased planting area, facilitated natural drainage, lower maintenance, but then also, habitat for really interesting species that can exist in cities. And finally, nature-friendly street lighting. This is a no-brainer. It's so rarely done, but we can have certain frequency of light coming from our street lighting that will improve, that will reduce the sort of impact on nocturnal invertebrates and mammals, but also, has no additional maintenance costs. It's a really simple change to lighting policies, and it can really improve night sky visibility for residents. I think that might be it for that case study, Georgia. So over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Sorry, everyone, about that little interruption. I was actually just trying to close things down so that my computer would run a bit faster. So I'm sorry about that. So the second penultimate BSUD example that we're going to show today is actually from Adelaide, and it's the Windsor Street linear reserve that Sarah mentioned earlier in her talk. So many of you are probably, you may be familiar with this particular linear reserve, and if you're not, I really encourage you to get down there because it really was quite beautiful. It was created by the City of Unley as part of a vision to really establish a green corridor between Erbray and the Adelaide Parklands. And the reason that I've included it here is that I just think it's such a great example of how infrastructure developments and other things that happen in cities, as well as the funding that is allocated to infrastructure developments and other things that happen in cities, can be leveraged for biodiversity and a really great biodiversity outcome. So this particular linear reserve came about alongside the replacement of an original open drain with boxed culverts. So they were doing this infrastructure redevelopment really to manage stormwater in this area. And although it wasn't originally framed as biodiversity sensitive urban design, a lot of the principles that we talk about are on display here. And also I think the intent was really there by the council to use this project as a way to enhance biodiversity in their suburb. So, for example, corridors were being prioritised to provide kind of unhindered bird movement through the environment. Plant selection included threatened plants and many species that exist in the kind of grey box woodland, which are now, only found really in small remnants in Adelaide. And they included this extremely diverse, both species-wise and structurally diverse, native vegetation. So I think they planted more than 15,000 Indigenous plants as part of this project from about 85 species. So this kind of huge diversity of native plant species that they used. So, as far as we can see, this is a great example of biodiversity sensitive urban design. They created habitat using both species and structurally diverse native vegetation. They incorporated novel resources within the linear park, so things like water bowls and habitat boxes to provide additional habitat and resources for the species. It's obviously designed to improve connectivity for biodiversity through the landscape. And it also really facilitates positive human-nature interactions through things like signage and the activation of the streetscape. And I've included here in the bottom right an image of, one of the a kind of little intervening part of this linear reserve where they're using fruit trees as a way to engage potentially elements of, people within the community who are not necessarily so focused on the nature kind of side of things or the native nature side of things. So really trying to bring together many different people with different values to engage in this space. And I think, there's some really important lessons for the future from a project like this. So, first of all, there's a lot of reasons why this project was particularly successful. They used a staged approach. So the initial first part of this project was really used to demonstrate to the community what a great asset this was going to be for their suburb. They had great relationships between their designers, their nurseries and their maintenance teams. And there was a really strong sense of project ownership and engagement from within the council. But I think, there are things that, you would do differently if you were approaching this as a biodiversity sensitive urban design project from the very start. So identifying those target or focal species can help to engage the community and also provide a really important touch point for the types of designs that you want to put in. And then enhancing engagement through things like wildlife gardening, which can make that connection between the private and the public realm and enhance the habitat beyond the park itself, and using different citizen science programs to kind of help understand and document the biodiversity value of a project like this. So I'll move on to Sarah, take you through the
Georgia.
Final case study.
Yeah, so the final case study, if you like, is actually just a series of case studies. It's the concept that small spaces, have a uniquely important role in cities for providing opportunities for BSUD. And if you go to the next slide, they're obviously critical for kind of creating that everyday nature sense. We obviously want to focus on our big rivers and big parks as sites for BSUD, but I can't overstate the importance of using opportunities for tiny spaces as a way of actually really embedding everyday nature and the benefits that it provides in cities. And, interestingly, small patches can be really critical for biodiversity. This was a study we did a few years ago that showed that small patches are disproportionately important for biodiversity in the world. So rather than just kind of deprioritising them, we should actually be really looking at them as places that can provide potentially, quite viable populations of threatened species. The next slide shows another paper that we wrote, which was about pop-up parks and how they really do punch above their weight in delivering ecological and social benefits in cities. And it was kind of inspired by this extraordinary art installation at the steps of the State Library in Victoria, which is this letter C kind of image on your screen there. And we found that, even though it was only there for a short while, it was a really extraordinarily diverse grassland that was put into this site, and instantly birds and insects flocked to the site, and people were just so enchanted by having it there. And it was a really great example of how tiny and even temporary small spaces can really deliver BSUD. So I've got a few examples here. One from Adelaide. This is one that we went to on our day of kind of looking at case studies in Adelaide. It was a really impressive little rain garden that was densely planted with diverse sort of species, diverse native species. So just a kind of a way of reducing the runoff and water issues from this tennis court, but in the process has delivered a really charming and diverse kind of small, tiny, but really significant green space that people can enjoy. The next one is an image. Oh, this is a Melbourne example. This woman here is a lovely person. She's a piano teacher, Emma Cutting, and she started this idea of a Melbourne pollinator corridor, and she thought, why not have a big corridor of habitat through South Melbourne where she lived and beyond, that could really sort of enhance streetscapes and really provide for pollinators. And so some images of the area where she's encouraged everyone to be part of this solution. It's a really positive, inspiring concept. But here are some of the kind of verges that have been planted up with native species for pollinators. And the next slide, I think, shows just some, extra habitat that's been provided. And, really, as I said, that sense of place, that beauty, that provision of habitat, and it's just so much better than, and really low maintenance in terms of council intervention. The next slide, I think, shows another green. Oh, this is actually a beautiful example from Melbourne, a small inner city school that developed up, and you can see the B slide there. That's actually my daughter sitting in the garden beds, but, a very highly urbanised kind of concrete school, if you like, and yet they found space to have an Indigenous garden, and not just an Indigenous garden, but they worked with traditional owners of Melbourne to identify totem species for the school. And here they have identified this very critically endangered species, the matted flaxley, that's now the school's totem. So the students have learnt how to care for and create habitat for the species. They're all now going home and planting habitat in their own gardens and planting matted flaxlilies. They've got one of the biggest populations of matted flaxlily left in Melbourne on the school grounds. It's a really inspiring intersection of cultural significance, teaching science through the lens of culture, but also threatened species. Generating much more beautiful and compelling schoolyards, and actually delivering all those kind of well-being and health benefits that I described before. And then I think I've got perhaps one more little example, which is just backyards. And I think Georgia already pointed to this, the idea that we can actually enhance habitat really intentionally through a program like Gardens for Wildlife. And we saw many places in Adelaide that I think could benefit from this, places with beautiful public land that's being managed either by volunteers or by council, but right abutting them will be gardens absolutely full of noxious weeds. And what if you could actually engage those neighbours in the whole process of being part of the solution to the biodiversity crisis by planting species in their own gardens that are going to be compatible and not hostile to the gardens on the other side of the fence, and also potentially attract birds and insects that are really sort of significant in that area. So just to quickly finish, I've got probably 2 more minutes left, maybe one. Where to from here? We have worked with Green Adelaide to try and produce this report, this blueprint for nature positive Adelaide, this idea that we can perhaps have, it's not a whimsical kind of ambition, it's actually quite a tangible really quite explicit idea of having really great metro-wide targets for how you can enhance biodiversity in Adelaide and work towards really sort of ambitious endpoints. You are really well positioned to do this. Interestingly, the COP15 that just emerged, that came out of Montreal just at the end of last year, had a really interesting target 12, which is actually to do with biodiversity inclusive urban planning. So you've got a global target to aim towards, but you're already well ahead of most places in the world, having this legislated BSUD priority. And if you skip to the next slide, the world is moving this direction. The idea of nature positive is really sort of screaming ahead. Here's an example in the UK of a policy that's about requiring all new developments to have biodiversity net gains on site. It's coming towards, and I think, as I said, Adelaide is very well positioned to be a trailblazer in this space. We've loved working with you. We love what you do, and we'd love to hear any questions that you have.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sarah and Georgia, for cramming so much into a short period of time. And it does look like we've got some great questions in there. I think you may have clarified one of them a little bit, but I thought it is a good one to clarify for people online that might not have come across it before, is the question of what is wildlife gardening?
Yeah, so this was an idea that sort of really started out in one tiny council in Melbourne and has now spread to multiple different councils across Australia. But the idea that a council can be quite explicit about talking to people about their biodiversity objectives. They can assess people's gardens for the potential they could provide for wildlife and then give them a plan. They often have the hook of having a bunch of free plants that are provided by a local native nursery. And then, as I think I perhaps skipped over it, but on the slide you saw some quotes from people who were interviewed. It's not only a way of actually providing habitat, it's also a way of generating community. And people who are involved in this program generally love it. Are really much more engaged with their neighbours, and I think someone said it's better than going seeing a psychiatrist in terms of their benefit to their mental well-being. So there are multiple benefits to that program.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, and we've had similar types of programs here in Adelaide over the years. We had backyards for wildlife, and at the moment Green Adelaide are actually just reviewing a lot of those resources. We've got a Creating Wildlife Friendly Garden booklet that's been refreshed that we're hoping to bring out very soon, and to have some more intentional engagement around that. And yeah, lots of people around Adelaide doing fantastic wildlife gardening projects on their verges and in their backyards as well. So really good to always clarify some of the terminology that we use all the time, that not everyone is au fait with as well. I just want to say thank you to Jenny Garden. I think she shared a PhD link for everyone, which I think would be great to follow up, just for those that can't see the chat, and we'll make sure that we put that in a follow-up email. And people were obviously very interested in your slides, but also just with the case studies, there was some interest around if they're shareable, just some of the budgeting and plans that have, some of that kind of background detail to some of those case studies for those that are trying to get some projects off the ground. Obviously, is that shareable?
Well, I mean, I think it'd be great to share it. I think we've written up a bunch of the case studies that I don't think they have budgets in them, but that would actually be a really great addition. Maybe that's something we could look at. The budgets are really interesting because a lot of the projects that we looked at in Adelaide were sort of piggybacking on other initiatives. And, the budgeting, you always have to be a bit creative in this space, sadly. But, learning about what creative approaches there are to sourcing funding, I think is certainly sort of worthwhile. So, yeah, we'll make sure that when we eventually put those case studies out, that we can try and sort of have that information included.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, any more details is great. And just a query, this is an interesting one, in the case studies that you've seen with rain gardens or verge planting. Is there increases in litter or is there increases in litter or and this question is double-barreled, maintenance costs?
Georgia, do you want to tackle this one?
Do you mean litter as in rubbish?
Rubbish.
Or litter
yeah,
as in leaf
I thought that was
litter?
an interesting question. Yeah. And someone's just replied in the chat to Ethan, at least maybe the litter's hidden in the hidden in the bushes and behind the trees and so forth, so it's not as obvious on the street. But I'm not sure if that's great for the actual vegetation. But yeah.
Look, definitely in the one we saw in Adelaide, there was no increase in litter. And so I think interestingly, the answer to is there an increase in leaf litter? I think sometimes you'd say, well, yes, and that's a good thing because, biodiversity is not just about the plants and animals that we see flying around in the sky. It's about, all of those other parts of the system that contribute to the microbial health of people and other species. So I think that's an interesting question, and there's often, I think, there's a really clear role for community engagement to play in sending a message to people that this thing is here for a reason. And the care that I was talking about really came out of this sense that for many people, native ecosystems may look messy. They're not that kind of stylized, hugely well-maintained kind of environment that people might be used to in cities. And for some people that can be quite confronting. But the cues to care is really about providing those cues to people that this is an environment that is like this for a reason and that someone cares about it. And so providing those cues to care, I think, can also stop things like littering and people treating these spaces like rubbish dumps. But I think it's something that has to be kind of deliberately tackled head on and maybe proactively as well. But there's definitely ways to go about doing that. I think there was a second part to that question.
Just that, yeah, there's a few in the chat just around,
maintenance.
The maintenance question, and if it is higher or if it's lower. Someone was also keen to kind of get some idea of that in terms of budgeting as well, because that could be a way to kind of sell the idea that this actually might reduce some maintenance costs, particularly if you've got highly engaged community helping and so forth as well.
Yeah, and I think that's rarely taken into account, actually, Christy, the fact that the engaged community can actually help to reduce maintenance costs. So I think there's some, I think there needs to be some really good cost benefit analysis kind of done of different strategies, because maintenance is something that comes up quite a lot. And, I think there's probably a role for people like us to be working towards articulating what the differences in costs are, because there was some work done in Queensland, a few years ago, which sort of suggested that part of the problem is that people, and I would include us in that, are set in their ways and don't really like change. And I think one of the things that probably is incumbent on us is to help maintenance crews and councils understand what are the likely changes and whether they actually cost more, because I can think of many examples where I think they wouldn't cost more. It's just that the maintenance is slightly different to what it might have been in the past.
But just to chip in without meaning to kind of, if it does cost more, isn't it worth it? I already spelled out those benefits to a city. We invest in all sorts of other infrastructure in our city enormously. I feel like every second day my street here in North Fitzroy is being torn up to kind of fix some sort of pipes underground or what have you. It's really not a huge extra cost that we should just consider to be critical infrastructure in cities. The fact that we have biodiverse greening and it's going to deliver health and well-being, climate change resilience, all the kind of benefits that I just described previously. I think we should start actually shifting the debate so that it's only not just a sort of maybe if it's not more expensive, but actually it's worth investing in.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And I think that's a really important point. And I was thinking about it when you were going through the Fisherman's Bend example, and I was just wondering, and I think you did give a little bit more detail in the Greenfield, but how to kind of bring all those stakeholders along with you at that very, from the outset, and what's your experience in terms of the diversity of stakeholders, so you don't just get the people that are pro biodiversity, but you get your developers and you get your community members and the businesses that are affected along the way. Because I see that because this is a process and it's working with people, that's the bit that really takes that time to really get that ownership. Yeah.
I think, yeah, Chrissy, I think Sarah's probably got something to say about this, but I also just noticed that Diane pointed out in the chat exactly the benefits of including your operations team members in discussions from the start, so that any of those maintenance issues can be addressed from the very start. And we often feel like we should have been more engaged with the engineers, for example, who design our streetscapes, because we start saying things like put more vegetation in, and then, you know, it all opens up because that's where all the utilities go. And so this process, I think, of co-designing with anyone who's going to be involved in the management of these areas is just so critical. And as I mentioned with Fisherman's Bend, the types of people we had in the room were, you know, high level kind of strategic planners who were thinking about strategic planning for Victoria. They were the infrastructure people who were thinking about what infrastructure developments needed to happen in Fisherman's Bend. There were community groups. There were traditional owners from two Aboriginal nations. And then there were kind of all of the engineering experts and streetscape planners and things like that. So having those people in the room to agree on the biodiversity objectives was just so critical for bringing them along. And so they're invested, they've got skin in the game when it comes to these, you know, slightly challenging conversations. What you want is everyone in the room saying, yes, this is maybe a little bit difficult, but we've all agreed we want this.
Yeah. And, you know, the benefit of biodiversity is it's actually a really easy sell. People, you know, anyone, even many engineers, really can be passionate about biodiversity when given a chance. I remember we had the head of the Fisherman Bend Authority demanding that we would try and bring back orange billy parrots to Fisherman's Bend, which would be a pretty, you know, tall ask. But, you know, the fact that they were engaged to the point of really sort of wanting to push us to kind of really, you know, have kind of much greater aspiration like that's a successful stakeholder engagement
session. Brilliant. And I think I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of that process and facilitating that process in a way that kind of pulls everybody together. So there was some other questions in there, but I think we're slowly running out of time. I'm just going to share my slide to finish us off and just point people in the right directions with some of those. So we will endeavour to answer some of those last questions that did come through then. And thank you all for engaging with everything today. And thank you so much for your time, Sarah and Georgia, and for the work that you're doing with Green Adelaide and broadly around Australia as well. Thank you all for joining us, and for those who'll be watching later. And I just wanted to also acknowledge all the great work that has already happened around Adelaide that, like you both were saying, might not necessarily have had the BSUD framework in it, but have been working for years supporting habitats. And, you know, some examples are the work with our hooded plovers and with the yellow-whiskered skipper butterflies down in Aldinga with bandicoots and tree martins. And, you know, there's been so much work that has been undertaken across Adelaide for lots of different species, the fauna as well as the flora. And it's just really exciting to look at the way that we can embed BSUD across all of these projects and really enhance them a little further. And in talking with the broader team and with Sarah and Georgia, it's really exciting to actually know that what we do in our urban environments really does make a difference. And we were talking about the planting and so forth that has occurred within the cities that has made habitat, for example, here in Adelaide, the flying foxes that have come to Adelaide because of what's been planted in the city. And that was unplanned. And so imagine if we planned and coordinated the kind of outcomes that can be achieved for species. And as you've outlined, you know, there's a number of challenges to this type of work, and we're spoiled for choice with lots of threatened species that need support. And there's lots of work that still needs to be done to understand their unique needs and the best way to support them. And that's really where Green Adelaide sees its role across Adelaide to kind of develop those resources and those pathways and provide guidance for people that are out there trying to, choose focus areas so that they can be, that particular threatened species can be really targeted in a meaningful way. So there's a number of ways that Green Adelaide are working towards this, and so I've just got a few of those up on the screen. So obviously it's a legislative responsibility, as you've said. It's also being embedded through the urban greening strategy, which is looking at the urban and tree canopy data, but not just trees, but also the biodiversity as well is all being embedded into that. And so you can go to our website and find out more about that. And we'll be really excited to email all of you that are online today when this blueprint when this background evidence base comes out and the case studies that Georgia and Sarah are talking to around people that they're talking to around Adelaide. And also the other thing quickly just to mention is that the Cooler, Greener, Wilder grants for local government working on BSUD, WSUD, rewilding and greening projects are actually open right now. So if you've been inspired by today and want to get a project up through local government, then please be in contact. We encourage you to join the Green Adelaide mailing list to receive our monthly newsletter, and we'll stay up to date with the upcoming sessions. And as Sarah mentioned at the start, our next session is how restoring urban ecosystems improves our health. And that one is going to be with Associate Professor Martin Breed from the University of Flinders University. And this session will explore the links between biodiversity and human health via the microbiome, and how restoring biodiverse urban green spaces can help improve human health. And so, as we know, we're all interconnected, and all of these sessions are very interconnected as well. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's 5:01. We made it. Thank you so much. See you next time.
Thanks so much, Christy. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.